So we are here to talk about creating a culture of empowerment. We're going to talk about what it is, why it matters, and how it can improve your life and business. My name is Todd Nienkerk. I'm CEO and co-founder at 4 Kitchens. We make big websites. We've done a lot of projects with media entertainment publishing companies like Turner, NBC, some others. We also work with a lot of higher education institutions, Stanford, Yale, University of Texas, Cal State, University of California, and several nonprofits, both small and large. Feel free to email me anytime. You can follow me on Twitter. Warning in advance, it's mostly like bad puns and wordplay, such as the following, and this would make sense if this were a bigger screen. You may not know who I am, but I'm big in Atlanta. All right, so before we get started, I want to preface this a little bit. So you're going to hear me talk a lot about what we do at 4 Kitchens. I want to emphasize that we're not bragging. This is all like hard-won, hard-fought knowledge through years of failure and experimentation and embarrassment and things that we've done very, very wrong and things that we continue to do wrong. So we don't have all of the answers, but we're actively trying to find them, which is the point of all of this, right? My opinions are also based largely in my experience in the web industry. I've pretty much only worked in web and publishing my entire life, so I know this doesn't apply to absolutely every industry. And I also want to point out that this is a really unusual talk for a DrupalCamp because it's not about Drupal. It's not about content management. It's not about the web. It's not about technology. It's about people and teams. So thank you to the organizers for being brave enough to include a session that is primarily about psychology, neurology, linguistics, and management. So this is why I care about this topic. I want to help people run better companies or teams by making those teams and leaders happier. I'm going to talk about very specific tactical and practical things that everybody here can do starting today with their teams, coworkers, clients. I really want things to be specific and actionable, and starting with broad abstract ideas and then boiling them down to things that you can actually do at work. So I like to tell stories. And I want to set the stage with an experience I had at the very beginning of my working career. So it was the summer of 2000. This was the summer of the dot-com bust. It had just happened weeks, months earlier. I worked for a startup in a suburb of Dallas. The startup was called Cyber Expo, Cyber XPO. Cyber Expo was a company that built physical internet kiosks for major shopping malls all over the country. Now, that doesn't seem to make any sense today because we all have the internet in our pocket. But at the time, if you wanted to check the price of something or just chat with your friends or kill some time or look at your email or whatever, you'd have to find an internet-connected computer somewhere. So they had these giant kiosks that were usually big circular things that would sit in a courtyard area somewhere in a shopping mall, and they had huge plasma screens across the top, and they would be blaring ads all the time. And my job was to upload all of these ads every night. So I worked kind of odd hours. One day, towards the end of that summer, the whole company got an email, and this email said, effective immediately, everybody is limited to 2 snacks per day from the break room. Now, this is a startup in the more classical startup sense of the year 2000. So there was stuff like the ping pong table and the break room with all the snacks and all of these things. So imagine getting that email. What do you think that email did immediately? Piss people off? Why is that?
I would say maybe you had unlimited snacks beforehand.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So something was being taken away, and you were thinking like, I'm entitled to this. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Anarchy? One would hope.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. What do you think this did to morale? Right? Lowered it. What do you think people started doing, like mathematically, with this? Right? Yeah, maybe looking for a new job. Well, so let's run through this. So I know what I did, and I was not alone. I thought 2 snacks per day. What is that really costing them? Right? This was a company of 30 people, 25, 30 people. So I opened up calculator application on my computer, and I thought, well, let's be generous and say these snacks cost 50 cents each, right? And these are the little tiny bags that you get from, Costco or Sam's Club or something. 50 cents a piece. So that's $1 a day that they are willing to spend on me. That's $5 a week that they're willing to spend on me. Let's say there are 20 people that work there. That's $100 a week, or about $5,000 a year. For the entire company, $5,000 a year for these 2 snacks per day. Is that $5,000 a year going to save anybody's job? Of course not, right? So then you start thinking, like, if they can't afford $5,000 a year, how can they afford me? And how is that going to save anybody's job, right? So you very quickly do the math. This takes seconds to do. And you start to see through this, right? Now, there's something else that's going on here, because there's the morale thing, and it's silly, and, rules, and, this just seems like bureaucracy and all this weird stuff. But something more profound and insidious is happening behind this, because let's walk through now the practical applications of this rule. So you've now established a rule. What must you do when you establish a rule? Enforce the rule. How do you enforce this rule? Do you have an office assistant sit in the break room and dole out the snacks and make little tick marks next to people's names on a clipboard every day? The amount of labor that somebody is going to put into enforcing this rule certainly will exceed $5,000 a year, right? So then, how do you actually enforce this rule if you don't have somebody sitting in the break room handing out snacks? How do you police this?
Hopefully not a camera.
Hopefully not a camera, but then somebody has to review the footage, right? Right? Right. So they, of course, did not have a camera. They did not have anybody with a clipboard. So what do? They assume we are going to police ourselves, or worse, each other, right? So now, Alex took 3 snacks yesterday. We're going to go out of business. How dare she, right? So now there's distrust. And there's this whole attitude of like, well, now you're telling me, before there were just snacks, and I could take snacks if I wanted them. Now you're telling me I get 2 snacks per day. Well, I'm going to be damn sure I'm going to take those 2 snacks per day. So I may actually be increasing the expense, right? That's another thing to consider. Third, now management is being littered with questions about these snacks. Do the snacks roll over? If I take 1 snack on Monday, can I take 3 snacks on Tuesday? Can I pick up 10 snacks on Friday and that's my lunch? So these questions start to roll in, and then they have to clarify all the questions, and you have to write a policy, and you have to document the policy, and you have to do all of this stuff. So what should they have done instead when they were trying to cut costs? Just eliminate the snacks. Just get rid of them entirely. They chose a half measure. Now let's look at this, though, from the perspective of management, because it's very easy as an employee to think about this and realize how silly this is and do the math and think like, oh, rules, and this is dumb, and, it's very easy to take it personally. But let's think of it now from the perspective of management. Management got together in a room and they said, man, things are tough. We're going to have to tighten the belt. We're going to have to do all of the little, metaphorical things that people do when they have to cut costs. Where can we do that? Well, we don't want to fire anybody. So let's maybe try to reduce office expenses and some of the maybe fringe benefits or these other things. Oh yeah, and we have all these snacks. Like, how much do we spend a year on snacks? Like 10,000, 15. Can we try to reduce that? Like, let's still have snacks, but let's not eliminate them completely, but we need to reduce costs. Like, okay, 2 snacks per day. Great, cool. Next thing. What's the next thing we can slim down, right? They have this benefit and they still want to offer the benefit. So they're just placing a limit on it because they want to save people's jobs. They want to save the company. So it's coming from a place of caring. It's coming from a place of empathy and wanting to do something nice for people. But because it's executed as a half measure and because it's just inviting all of these questions and criticisms, the execution was poor. And not surprisingly, several months later, mostly because people don't really care about having internet access in shopping malls, the company did not survive. So we're here to talk about culture of empowerment. And I want to talk first about what culture is. Like, what does it mean? Because we say that a lot. Like, oh, the culture there is great, or the culture there is toxic, right? So what does it mean? If you look it up in the dictionary, These days it's dictionary.com. It means the behaviors and beliefs characteristic of a social, ethnic, or age group. So let's think about social groups. Work is a social group. Absolutely, right? It's not just your friends and family. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, Americans work on average 8.7 hours per day. That's more than a third of our waking life during the weekday. That's about a third or quarter of our life over the course of our lifetime. Major social group, right? So work is a culture. It is a social group. But more importantly, I think that culture affects how you think and feel about a group from the outside looking in. It's internal, but it's also from the outside looking in. And I want to demonstrate the idea of thoughts and feelings about a culture with this experiment. So I'm going to show you a series of images. And I'd like you to just register your initial emotional reaction to these images, to yourself, and I'll ask you about them at the end. Just take note of what you feel throughout this slideshow. Okay? Here we go. What did you feel?
All kinds of different emotions.
What are a couple of them?
Loyalty, uncomfortableness, disappointment, anger.
Mm-hmm. So some positive, some negative.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else? You more or less agree with that range?
I just felt like, yep, that's America from TV.
Interesting. So there's a lot of conflict both in those images and about those images. And the point here is that, here we are at an event about an open source content management system called Drupal, all in Atlanta, Georgia, right? And yet we have, even within ourselves, a lot of conflicting feelings about those images and what they might communicate. So everybody has a slightly different reaction, even within oneself. And that's because we don't really share a single homogeneous culture. And that's because culture actually has many layers, and I want to deconstruct those for a moment. So there is a human culture, a broader human culture that transcends nationality and ethnicity. Many anthropologists, social scientists, psychologists have all observed, for example, that there are underlying sets of emotions that cross cultural boundaries. Happiness, sadness, certain facial expressions that communicate things rather universally, even among some of the uncontacted tribes in Brazil and really remote areas. So usually a smile means you're happy, a frown means you're sad or frustrated. It's pretty universal. There's also a language layer. And I'm going to come back to language later on because it's quite profound. So language informs a lot about our culture. It informs how we think, how we reason, how we explain things to one another. And you can go from one part of the United States to another, from California to Minneapolis or from New York to Texas, and we use different languages. We use different words. We use not quite dialects, but very subtle things that give away where somebody is from, or maybe how they grew up, or what their thought process is. So language both reflects and informs our culture. We also have national cultures. So think, for example, about the differences between the US and Canada. Very few countries in the world are as alike as the United States and Canada, and yet there are profound and deep differences between the two. For example, let's just say healthcare, right? In the United States, it's a major political hot-button issue. We do not treat healthcare as a value. And in Canada, not only is it a value, it is an inalienable human right to have healthcare. That's an extreme difference. But yet culturally, you look at SNL, most people in SNL, they're Canadian. Like we derive a lot of our humor and our politics and a lot of the things that we talk about on a regular basis from Canada. So we're quite similar, but also quite different in other respects. And of course, there are layers like local. So the city you live in, whether you live in an urban area or the suburbs or the exurbs or in a rural area, culture is different. And of course, there's the culture of the self. So we all have our own unique personal experiences that inform how we think and feel. So these are many layers. These are just some, but how culture kind of wraps around itself. So we talked about culture. What is empowerment? What do we mean by empowerment? So again, we go back to the dictionary. Empowerment is the giving or delegation of power or authority. So that's what's being given. But what does it mean to be empowered? What does it mean to receive empowerment? How does it change your way of thinking? So let's talk about what it means. And I think it means 4 things. And this is kind of the underpinning of all of the practical, tactical things that I'm going to talk about momentarily. First, empowerment is the autonomy to decide what you will do and, most importantly, how you will do it. Second, it's the freedom to challenge without fear of reprisal. 3, it's the power to effect change. You have to actually be able to make change. And when you've made that change, you must own the outcome, ownership of outcome. So again, autonomy to decide what you will do and how you will do it, the freedom to challenge without fear of reprisal, the power to effect change, ownership of outcomes, all boils down to controlling your own destiny. That's what empowerment is really about. And this is really what we all seek in one way or another. I'm a fan of talking about the why, so let's talk about who cares, right? We're here to talk about empowerment, but why does that matter? From a business perspective, why does it matter? We all personally know why it matters, but from a business perspective. First of all, empowerment makes teams happy. It absolutely increases productivity, quality, work, retention. When people feel like they have destiny over the work that they're doing, they're happier and they want to control what they're doing. It makes your clients happy, or stakeholders. A happy team is enthusiastic about the work, and that's going to show, right? You always know when you're dealing with somebody who likes what they're doing, is engaged and enthusiastic. So that enthusiasm is infectious. Everybody hears it, feels it, and sees it. And most importantly, an empowered team has the ability to make clients happy directly, not just indirectly through their enthusiasm, but to actually make things happen. So there are these kind of cheesy examples, and I'll talk about why we feel cheesy, these things are cheesy later on, of retail outlets that have name tags that say what can I do to help you today? Or, I can fix that, or whatever. When companies are actually empowered, when they empower their team to do things, to solve a client's problem or a customer's problem, your experience as a customer is far greater. For example, you hear a lot of people say things like, oh, that's not my department, that's above my pay grade, I don't know, that office is closed. That's so frustrating every time we hear that, right? Let's just get this done. But if those people are actually empowered, you as a customer or client would be a lot happier. And finally, empowerment enables leadership. So if you are self-employed, or if you are leading a project or just an initiative within your organization, you don't have to be a company owner or manager or anything. You can delegate, and that frees you up to do what you're supposed to do, which is oversee the totality of the project you're working on, whatever that might mean. It might mean building the company or focusing on long-term goals or creating new benefits packages or something. But when you're in the weeds, it's very, very difficult to actually get your real work done. So among you here, how many of you at some point have said to your friends or coworkers or significant others at some point, all I feel like I'm doing is reacting instead of planning? Right? I'm sure we've all had this feeling at some point. All I do all day is just answer emails or answer phone calls or deal with the latest crisis, and I don't feel like I'm getting ahead of any of this stuff. If your team is empowered, or the people that you work with are empowered to take on the delegation of stuff that you should be doing, it frees you up to become a planner rather than a reactor. So let's talk about how to do that. Very specific practical things. The first is language. So the interesting thing about language is, let's think about what language means. A lot of us, and this is common sense and it totally makes sense, think that language is the reflection of thought. That we have thoughts in our head, and language is a vehicle that we use to organize and transmit those thoughts to other people, so that I can then project a thought into your head and we can share the same thought, right? That's the idea of language. Well, what's interesting is neurologists and anthropologists are starting to understand more about the role of language, and in fact, language is not the reflection of thought. Language is thought. And if you do not possess language, you do not possess thought in any way that is really constructive or understandable to us. And they've been able to do these studies with people who, for whatever reason, were neglected as children and weren't given language, weren't taught language, and then suddenly, over many years, were rehabilitated to have language, and they talk about what it was like before having the state of language, where they did not really possess thought. They were just reacting to stimuli, you know, like a thing in a petri dish. You know, I'm hungry, I want food. I'm angry, so I'm going to scream, right? Language actually is thought. So therefore, language physically affects the structure of your brain. It physically affects how you actually organize your thoughts in your day. So we need to make changes to the language that we use in the workplace. We need to say we, not I. We have to say team or coworkers or colleagues, not employees, not the E word. And I know that this starts to sound cheesy because we see those posters like there is no I in team and but there is a me, you know, stuff like that. And we think that that stuff is cheesy because we've grown cynical. Often the people who have posters like that up in their office don't mean them, right? It's just a showpiece. So we've grown cynical around that. But this is actually true, and it is very powerful. So our, not my. Second thing you can do is to ask for input every day in some format. People, this is one of the fundamental principles at Four Kitchens and how we deal not just with interpersonal conflicts within the team, but also with our clients. And this is good UX experience for people who do user research. People want to be heard more than they want to be agreed with. People want to be heard more than they want to be agreed with. Just getting something off your chest is really powerful, right? It doesn't matter quite as much that somebody says, I completely agree and that's exactly what we're going to do, but it does matter when somebody says, I hear you and I understand where you're coming from. Empathy, right? Very simple, very powerful. There's also this idea of having an open door policy. That's great. How many people here have an open door policy, right? I'm sure we all do. All the doors are open all the time, everywhere. That's great. That's one thing. But actually inviting people inside is another. So when you have an open door policy, that's great. That's a good first step. But it's passive. You have to be active in soliciting input. So you have to invite people inside through the door, through the threshold to talk to you about stuff. You have to catch up with people when the concern is timely. So react right away. Talk to people. You seem frustrated. What's going on? Right? Hey, you're in a great mood. What happened? Like, what can we celebrate? Right? You have to also, when asking for input, you have to ask questions that demand real answers. We have this socialized linguistic tick in American culture of asking, how are things going? And we always answer, fine, or okay, or great. They never really are. And when anybody gives an answer that deviates from that, it just feels so strange. Like, hey, how's it going today? Let's say we're buying coffee early in the morning. How's it going? Oh man, today is just, I don't want to hear this. You've asked a real question, but you're not demanding a real answer. You don't want a real answer when you ask that question. So when you ask people on your team or your clients or whoever, hey, how are things going? What are they going to say? Fine, great, whatever, right? You have to ask questions that make people stop and think and demand real answers. So, for example, what's something you've done in the last week that you're really proud of? What's something that if you could wave a magic wand, you could change right now? What's frustrating you at this very moment? What kept you awake last night? Right? These are things that make people stop and think and remove themselves from this socialized rut of How are you? I'm fine. How are you? I'm great. Good. Let's keep going, right? Speaking of feedback channels, you have to provide these channels that are accessible, non-argumentative, and genuine. The best example of this I've heard, and you've probably read this example before, but I'm going to walk through it anyway, is the Toyota assembly line and the andon cord. Has anybody here heard of the andon cord? Ooh, I get to tell it to a room full of new people. Good, good, good. Okay, so let's think about assembly lines. Let's think about Ford. So Ford invented the assembly line. Great innovation in manufacturing, right? Everybody has one specific task that they perform, and they do it over and over and over again. Now that presumes that everybody does it well, and everybody does it correctly, and that everything moves through the assembly line without problems. But that's never really the case. There are flaws. There are missed welds, bolts that aren't tightened properly, panels that aren't installed correctly. So what happens, or what happened until a couple decades ago when a lot of this started to get reformed at a Ford assembly line? Well, somebody would notice a bad weld, and they'd make a note of it, but don't stop the assembly line. Because if you stop the line, you are losing, what's the first thing that's going to happen? A manager is going to come out and say, what the hell's going on? We're losing $1 million a minute. Like, keep going, right? Well, then you wind up installing the seat over the bad weld, and then you have to put the, the exterior on, and now you've got the paneling on, and now that weld is buried deep, deep, deep within the car. And there's a note on it that says, by the way, there's a bad weld in, wherever. It gets sent out to, there's a giant lot outside of Ford that are all the things, these are all cars that weren't really assembled properly. And it's somebody's job to go through them at some point in the future and then disassemble everything and fix that weld and then reassemble everything. Do you think that ever actually happens or happens correctly? Of course not. Nobody's going to get around to it. It's a huge amount of waste. So Toyota put in place this idea of the andon cord. The andon cord is a single cord that runs the length of the assembly line from one end to another that is within arm's reach no matter where you are. And when you pull it, rather than the sirens and the screeching halt of the assembly line, right? Manager comes running out. What the hell's going on? We're losing $1 million a minute. When you pull the andon cord, there's a delightful little jingle that plays. And everything slows to a halt, and a manager comes out and says, thank you. What do we need to fix? Accessible. The andon cord is within arm's reach at all times. Non-argumentative. There are no blaring sirens, red lights, no manager comes out and yells at you. They say, thank you. We know we're losing money. Let's get the line moving again, but how do we fix this? And genuine. They mean it. They really want to get better. There's also a culture within Toyota where they have a competition to see how many fractions of a second they can shave off of certain motions by rearranging bins and putting things within different configurations. It's fascinating. So encourage people to know that things are in their control, that they can provide feedback on things like this. As a leader or manager, you have to own your mistakes. You have to be the first one to own your mistakes. You have to set an example. So admit failure. You have to solve and not blame. And this builds trust. Trust facilitates empowerment. So you can't actually empower somebody until they trust you, because they're not going to believe you. We've all had really bad work experiences where somebody says, like, I want you to tell me anytime there's something going on, and then they get mad at you, right? And then, of course, once burned, twice shy, right? So own your mistakes by example. Be the first one to speak up at meetings and say, hey, I really messed something up the other day. I'm sorry about that. Be a good person. Be the better person. Apologize. It's hard to do, but it helps foster the proper culture. You also have to hire the right people, and you have to think about values. So I've given this talk for a couple of years now, and I've written about this subject of building teams and hiring and things like this for a while. And a few years ago, I was really honored to be included in a Harvard Business Review article about the hiring process. I got like a little paragraph to myself where I talked about this thing that we used at Four Kitchens called the airport test. I was very proud of this. It wasn't my idea, but it was something that we implemented. The airport test is when you're in the process of hiring somebody, you put yourself in the mental experiment of, what if I am stuck in an airport layover with this person for 8 hours? How am I going to feel at the end of those 8 hours? And I got quoted talking about the airport test, and I was happy, and I put something up on Facebook about it, and I was like, cool, look, I'm in HBR. And then I read the internet comments. And the very first comment was somebody saying, the airport test, huh? Sounds like a great excuse for exclusionary hiring practices. And that hurt so much because they were right. They were absolutely right. Because when I think about people that I want to hang out with at an airport, who are they? They're just like me. They're exactly like me. White guys. That's what that means. So we don't do the airport test anymore. Because that was misguided. Own your mistakes, right? We now have a values test. We ask people about their values. We ask people about what drives them. We have publicly stated, published values. We ask them to read them and understand them and see if they align to them. We ask questions about your philosophy on the work product that you do and sharing that work product with people. Open source, right? We talk about how you would want to diffuse conflict. What are some things that you value about diverse workplaces? These are the kinds of values and questions that we talk about now. So that's the first thing, to hire the right people. There are a couple of other little axioms that are absolutely true but bear repeating. Slow to hire, fast to fire. If somebody is not a good fit at the organization, it means that they're not a good fit for you and you're not a good fit for them. It goes both ways. So you have to make those difficult decisions quickly. We're not very good at that. And you have to hire people for your team who are absolutely smarter and better than you. And a lot of people are intimidated by that. I'll come back to that in a moment. Here's a big one. Consider going virtual or distributed. We did this officially July 31st of this year. We are now a distributed company. It took us 3.5 years to get there. It takes a long time, but there are some really excellent benefits. This is a talk unto itself, maybe even a whole day like lecture. But strongly consider, please, distributed teams, remote teams, virtual teams. It allows a lot of flexibility. It allows a lot of people control and destiny over where they live and what they do. And if their partner has to move to a new place because of a job, they can go with them and they don't have to leave your organization, right? You can hire the best people in the world no matter where they are. Relatedly, let your team set their own schedules. Consider things like flexible work schedules throughout the day. There's a guy on our team who is a musician and he needs it's creative work, so he needs a big block of time in order to sit down in the music studio and do his work. So he works what's called a 4-10 schedule, 4 days a week, 10 hours a day. It's not easy on the rest of the team, but we make it work because we want to support him in his passion. And he, as a result, of course, deeply appreciates that we're willing to be flexible around that. Also consider open vacation policy. This, in a nutshell, is take however much time you need, as long as you need it, whenever you need it, as long as you're not inconveniencing other people. Unduly inconveniencing other people. And a lot of people say, like, well, boy, if I hire somebody and I have unlimited vacation, what stops them from just not ever coming to work and saying they're on vacation? I have to pay them all the time. No, you don't. You fire them. Really? Like, that's your excuse for not enacting this policy? That's crazy. If people abuse policies, they aren't the right people. They don't share your values. They don't belong in your organization. Some people are, in fact, just along for the ride. You have to invest time and money in your team's success. So consider things like professional development budgets. Help them pay to go to events like this, or to become certified in something, or to take a class that's really interesting. Our director of operations, one of the things that we do that's kind of unusual, we don't require formal education at all for any position at 4Kitchens. We've hired lots of people who, I don't even know if they graduated high school, and frankly, I don't care. They're smart. They do great work. Our director of operations never finished college. So she is now taking 2 days a week to finish her bachelor's because it's something that she's wanted to finish for the past 13, 14 years. It's a matter of pride for her, and we absolutely want to support her in this. And what's especially, just as an aside, what's especially insulting about this whole, like, everybody has to have a bachelor's degree thing, she is an HR professional in the sense that she works in HR, and she's been doing this a long time, and she's run her own businesses. She knows what she's doing. But in order to actually become certified as an HR professional by the HR Professionals Association or whatever it is, right, you have to either have, I think, 5 years of direct experience in an HR capacity, in an HR leadership capacity, or a bachelor's degree in anything in the world, anything at all. That doesn't make any sense. Like, that just seems like you're building a class system around education. Ridiculous. Whoops. Encourage personal brands. So I mentioned earlier hiring people that are smarter and better than you. This is where it starts to get a little sticky. So encouraging personal brands is the idea that you want people to get really good at what they do, and if they want to be famous for what they're doing, help them be famous for what they're doing. If that matters to them, if they want a personal brand, if they want to be able to speak about stuff, help them make that happen. Now, I've heard a lot of people in confidence say things like, well, if they get to be too good, they're going to leave. What does that say about you, that you're worried about that? You know, it says to me two things. One, you don't like the organization or the team or the initiative that you've built. You don't have faith in it yourself, that you think other people will get too good and they'll want to leave. And secondly, you're not being realistic. Everybody leaves. Everybody leaves. They either retire or they quit or they get sick or they die. That's the reality. So don't you want to leave having known that you've helped them achieve that next level or some degree of personal fulfillment? Won't the goodwill that you carry forward with that person into the future and all the connections they make for the rest of their lives, won't that outweigh the fact that you get another 3 months of billable time out of them? Right? Here's another one that's kind of controversial. A lot of companies say, especially consultancies, will say, okay, if you're joining, you can't work on anything else outside of client work. Right? Pretty standard, actually. I think that's horribly misguided for two reasons. One, if you tell somebody they can't do something, what do they want to do? They want to do it, right? You're creating, what's the word? Desire, yes, but resentment is the word I'm looking for. You are creating resentment within your team. They resent the fact that you're being told that, what do you mean I can't do what I want to do in my own free time? Obviously, they shouldn't be like robbing you of your clients, and that doesn't really happen a lot. And it does happen from time to time, but it's very, very rare. And you can protect yourself against that, but this goes too far. So it creates resentment, first. Second, along with actually, back to the resentment thing, I have found in 100% of cases, people who have said, hey, I'm taking on some freelance work, I'm just going to let you know. You say, great. Give them enough rope. Right? They realize very quickly, ooh, I'm not doing that again. That sucked. Like I was working 40 hours a week and then I went home and I had to do another 40 hours because guess what? The client was crazy. You know? Like you just let them do it and they figure it out. They burn themselves out and they're like, good, you learned. Now you know why it's not a good idea. Let's move on. Right? But on the benefit side, the people who are able to make it work and who can balance it and do have the initiative to make this happen, they're probably not doing the same work that you're doing. Not the same. They might be doing web design and development, for example, but they're not taking on the same clients. Like that's not realistic. But what they're going to learn in taking on personal work is they're going to learn all about billing and account management and project management and scoping and design. They're going to learn all the stuff that they're not doing at their daily job. They might be a developer and they focus on code all day long. Well, now if they're taking on freelance work, they have to do billing. You know, they have to know what it's like to track time and then actually convert that to dollars and send the invoice and then argue the invoice with clients, right? They have to learn all the steps. And because the projects that they're taking on outside of work are probably much smaller, much more limited budgets, they have to be really scrappy. And they're going to figure out things like, well, I don't have enough time to custom build all of this functionality, so I'm going to go dig through Drupal.org or WordPress or something and find that module or plugin or something that gets me 80% of the way there. And now I know about that module. And oh, guess what? 3 months later, back at my main job, similar problem comes up. Oh, I know about this module that I found out about because I was doing freelance work. That has actually happened like multiple times at 4 Kitchens, and it's really valuable. Consider adopting agile methodologies because it allows teams to self-organize. It's a destiny thing, right? You control your own empowerment by deciding what you work on next, by getting people to work together, divvying up tasks amongst themselves rather than being told what to do and how to do it. Relatedly, don't tell people how to do things. So emphasize instead setting goals and then let people get there. And this part is like really tough. This is really tough. This one's really tough for me because I've been at this 10.5 years now, and there are just certain things that I know are likely to fail. And I really want to stop that from happening. Like, that's a normal human reaction, but also you just have to sometimes let people, just like if they want to do freelance work, you have to let them do the sleepless nights and learn that it was really tough and they shouldn't do that ever again. You just have to let people fail. And definitely never tell people what tools or technology to use. That will drive them absolutely crazy. Like, that's their job. They're smarter and better than you because you hired them, right? Let them do what they want to do, how they want to do it. Setting boundaries beyond what the person currently feels. This means just push people a little bit. You know, a lot of the stuff is going to be uncomfortable. A lot of people operate in like a resting state, you know, like they're kind of okay with the way everything is now. They're not really going to change unless acted upon. An immovable object, right? An object at rest will stay at rest unless acted upon by an outside force. Same thing happens within business, happens within team dynamics. Some people have that momentum built in and they will take that responsibility and power and they'll be happy to empower themselves. Most don't. You have to encourage them. You have to assure them that they are capable. A lot of people in our industry face imposter syndrome constantly. Like, oh, I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to build that. That company's way better. This client's out of my league, right? You have to constantly challenge people and their assumptions. You have to accept that your team knows more about the work than you do, because again, you hired them and they're smarter than better than you. Also, though, more subtly, your team is doing the actual work. Now, whether you're leading an initiative or you are on the client side or the consultant side, the people that you're working with know more about what they do than you do. So accept that and let them guide the direction of your team or the initiative or the project or your company, because they're actually in the trenches. They're doing the actual work. So respect that. And finally, you have to constantly exemplify, pursue, praise, reinforce empowerment. You have to show it. You have to demonstrate it. Make it a regular conversation. So we have a tradition at Four Kitchens. Every Monday and Thursday morning we have a half-hour all-hands meeting. We're about a 30-person company. So it's not the easiest thing in the world to do, but we're able to get it done. We have an all-hands meeting called Team Hugs. Team Hugs does two things. First, we do kudos. And kudos is just a round table. Hey, I've got kudos for Alex because she did a really good job diffusing a difficult situation with a client last week, right? She was empowered to do that. It could be, hey, thanks, Mike, for helping me out with, had a bunch of code collisions and we had to sort that out. It took a few hours, but man, we're moving along now. So just calling out thank yous to people for doing specific things, keeping track of those throughout the week. And then the other thing we do in Team Hugs is we always ask a question of some sort. And sometimes they're silly and sometimes they're serious, but the idea is to get to know one another. In a distributed company, there aren't a lot of opportunities for people to talk or run into each other. There's no break room, there's no water cooler, so you have to create those experiences. That's an aside. But most importantly, and this is another one of those fundamental philosophies of our organization, asking for help is not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of empowerment. It means that they're empowered to be vulnerable. And you have to approach the request for help from that side, not from the angle that it's inconvenient or you should know better or why did we wind up in this situation, right? They're asking for help because they feel empowered to seek it. So I know that there are a lot of things that probably don't apply to your organization or lots of things that you're doing that I haven't enumerated here. So very briefly, I want to go over the 3 guiding principles of empowerment so that you can maybe start to frame your own rules and processes. First is to give people control over their own destiny. You have to treat your coworkers as responsible professionals because they are, by and large. They are adults that you can collaborate with. They are not children that you manage. This leads to mutual respect. And in the knowledge industry, in what we do, web design development, people are self-motivated, they're self-directed, they tend to be professionals. People want the freedom of freelancing because it's not that far away. Most of us could freelance. But they also want the security of a full-time job, and they want the career satisfaction of working with the team and doing projects that they alone could not do. So you have to actually provide the culture of freelancing with the structure of an organization. And most importantly, in controlling their own destiny, let people succeed or fail. You have to make trust the center of your culture, so be transparent, own your own mistakes, and be vulnerable at all times. And finally, most importantly, build a company or team or project or product or initiative you would want to work for. So think really hard. If you are a manager or a leader or a company owner or something, just take a moment to think about the following question. If you worked for yourself and had to report to yourself every day, how would that make you feel? That can be a tough one. So I want to end with an example of building a company you would want to work for. Earlier I talked about Cyber Expo, the 2-snack company, right? It's very easy to point out all the flaws in an organization and all the mistakes that were made and whatever. But I have to give this company credit because they were actually a huge inspiration for me later on when we wound up creating a consultancy. They did something really remarkable, like profoundly, profoundly cool and selfless. That summer also happened to be the summer that my mom was diagnosed with terminal cancer. And it was a matter of weeks. They gave me the rest of the summer off and paid me so that I could spend that time with my mom. They did not have to do that. And I was 18 at the time. I had no idea that a company, like, you can even do that? Like, that's a thing that you could even decide to do? And they did. They were losing money. They had to cut back to 2 snacks a day, and yet they paid me for a month before I left for school. And I've carried that lesson with me every day, because that was the kind of company that, despite the 2-snack thing and their little gaffes here and there, really tried to create a cool culture where they would welcome this 18-year-old fresh out of high school, who is this guy? He's leaving at the end of the summer anyway, who cares? Remarkable, right? That's the kind of company that I would want to work for. Questions? Thoughts? Reactions?
I agree with everything.
Was there anything in particular that hit home for you? Or anything that you thought like, oh man, like, because admittedly, the vast majority of the things in here are not so much like, this is what we're doing, as these are areas where we need to improve, right?
Oh yeah, I mean, one thing I was thinking is like, so it was a cool presentation and it touched on all the great points, but I'm trying to figure out how, like, I don't know if just viewing the presentation is enough for stuff to hit home for people so that they start doing those things. That's what I was thinking.
Fair enough. I think that we owe it to ourselves to create a community around this, to enforce it, reinforce these messages.
I feel like I have to be in the trenches.
Mm-hmm.
It's like it's a long effort.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely.
To change that.
Absolutely. I would recommend, there are, for those of you who are interested in this like alternative approach to management and not so top down, but more like collaborative and flat, there are a number of communities and organizations that philosophically are more or less aligned with this. There's one called the Bureau of Digital Affairs. It's kind of a tongue-in-cheek name, but they do events like Owner Camp, Owner Summit, Digital PM Summit, Creative Director Summit, Operations Summit. Fantastic event of like-minded organizations, mostly in the web space. People who talk about these kinds of issues and are very vulnerable in this space. You normally think that, company owners or CEOs or team leaders are very like standoffish and kind of cold and like, I'm not going to talk about money and I'm not going to talk about these things because that's all proprietary knowledge and you're my competition and all of that. But yet these are communities where people get together and talk about this stuff very openly and very transparently. There are also, and this is on the more traditional side of things, there are groups like Vistage. I have mixed feelings about Vistage, but it's a CEO therapy group, really. You pay a monthly fee and you attend various meetings, and people, depending on the community that you're part of, local community, are sometimes vulnerable. It's also a networking thing. Sometimes the networking thing takes over. But there are communities out there of companies, and in fact, the Drupal community itself is a really good example of this community of people trying to do something different. And there are a lot of thematic things in this talk that relate to just the Drupal community as a whole and how we relate to sharing and giving back and being transparent with our code and our business practices.
One thing that really resonated, Todd, was what you said around there's this perception that if you're busy at work and just replying to every email within 5 minutes that comes to you, and attending a lot of meetings, that's what you're supposed to be doing. And we have found, to your kind of question, that we had a lot of people who had KPIs and longer range goals, and their feedback was, well, I got diverted, an RFP came up, something unexpected happened. So we distilled it down to, from an empowerment standpoint, 2 questions. What are you going to accomplish, and how will I know when it's done? So when we have a department meeting, I'll ask the department leader, you told me you wanted to develop your personal brand and write a blog post on this topic that you've been procrastinating about for weeks. So if that's what you want to accomplish, how will I know when it's done? I'll know when it's done when it's published, right? So just something like as simple as that has had, it's still in an experimental phase, but been positive, overall.
And that's a great example of asking questions that demand real answers, right? All right, cool. I think the next session is starting pretty soon. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.